Larry and I have collaborated actually at this site I'm going to talk about. So this is also about heritage in China, or tourism and heritage in China. And I'm looking at it from a different perspective, starting with the giant picture of the whole concept of world heritage, and then thinking about how it applies in China, and why I think much of the critiquing of the Chinese government when it comes to world heritage actually should be aimed back at UNESCO. So beginning in with 1992, I think it was World Heritage Annual Meetings, at the international level, within groups like UNESCO and WTO and the World Bank, there's been the emergence of a new heritage paradigm, which supporters claim is based on a transparent and democratic structure that is aimed to ensure social, economic, and cultural benefits to local communities at World Heritage sites, as well as the importance of sustainability, which is a term that is quite interesting because we use it so much, but we seldom define what we mean by it. So in other words, communities are now supposed to be empowered, not dispossessed, through participating in the heritage process. When this doesn't happen, as is the case at various sites in the People's Republic of China when it comes to World Heritage, the blame is usually placed squarely on the shoulders of state actors. Yet this blame sort of naming tends to ignore how UNESCO imagines the nebulous concept of community, which is at the heart of this idea that you empower something called a community. So for example, when we look at UNESCO Heritage Management Guidelines, they stress the importance of local participation. They state that in the process, with the caveat that residents first understand and accept a particular meaning of heritage. This in turn assumes that the category of local stakeholder is synonymous with a homogeneous community, thereby ignoring the social realities that simultaneously divide and shape public discussions on topics such as heritage. In one of the only cases in which World Heritage status has been rejected at the local level, the Besaki Temple Complex on the island of Bali, and one of the two cases in which a World Heritage Site has actually been delisted, Germany's Elbe Valley, the key factor in both was the presence of a robust civil society that could resist heritage interventions, i.e. democracy worked in both cases. This shift in UNESCO rhetoric to inclusion, rights, and sustainability is, I argue, rooted in three foundational assumptions. First is the notion that culture, both as a social practice and in material form, is threatened by and thus must be protected from globalization. Second, that within a community, this thing called culture is manifested by a unified view among community members that, once identified by outsiders, can then be empowered on the side of heritage. And third, that the basis of this holistic view is a cosmopolitan vision of being at home in the world. All right? Just to give it real quick, I'm not going to read this, but that still is the foundational view that UNESCO uses when it speaks of world heritage, which obviously when you think of it in a practical term, doesn't actually make much sense. Or maybe I'm being too practical. The idea that this is owned by our people. In terms of the cosmopolitanism, obviously one issue is, particularly now when you talk about intangible protection, you can't protect all human practices. So UNESCO actually defines what gets protected, i.e. those practices that fit the UNESCO worldview, right? So given this, right, in other words, UNESCO's approach to heritage assumes that a shared consensus exists on the value of this thing called outstanding universal value, both in a tangible and intangible sense. Where consensus is not found, this is often taken to be simply an awareness problem, i.e. people have to be taught. So in other words, people are supposed to value their heritage for the paradoxical reason that it doesn't actually belong to them, but to something called humanity. Of course, UNESCO is neither monolithic in its structure nor fossilized in its approach, and we know that, as we can see in the continued expansion of the heritage category to neighborhoods, communities, landscapes, social practices, and in my research work, which was carried out in part with the help of my colleague Larry, what was until recently a relatively isolated mountain valley in North China that contains dozens of Han, Tibetan, and Mongolian Buddhist temples, monasteries, and sacred sites. What UNESCO downplays, however, is the World Heritage Site's relationship with ongoing social and cultural practices. That is, the importance of intangible practices at tangible sites. Indeed, UNESCO's advocacy for community involvement and management falls short in China not only because non-state institutions are tightly controlled in the People's Republic, which is the case, but also because neither a holistic community voice nor shared interest exist when it comes to issues such as heritage, whether China or, for example, with the Harbor Project, or if you remember when the baseball stadium was built in DC, that was quite contested. And it's happening now with the soccer stadium. I think yesterday the city evoked eminent domain to, in essence, take property from people and displace them. And then finally, this empowerment of local residents, I think it's crucial to think about the place in which this notion of buffer zones plays when it comes to World Heritage. In the most recent operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, that's the title, published by UNESCO in 2012, this document states that, quote, wherever necessary, a buffer zone should surround World Heritage properties with complementary legal and/or customary restrictions placed on its use and development to give an added layer of protection to the property, unquote. The management of each site should involve what they say includes all partners and stakeholders who in turn should have, quote, a thorough shared understanding of the property, unquote. And then finally, these communities and shareholders or stakeholders should be encouraged to participate in management plans as long as they do so in what UNESCO calls an ecologically and culturally sustainable manner, unquote. And then to give you some context to this, that's what I just talked about. This I don't have to talk about, Larry's mentioned this, just to give you a sense of the scope of heritage in China, right? Which obviously makes a lot of sense when it comes to material culture because it's a landmass that's been inhabited for close to 3,500, 4,000 years, right? That's the rationale. Much like with the tourism rationale, the heritage rationale is very similar in China. So the heritage industry is booming. And then finally, here's this place in English, Wutai, Mount Wutai, in Chinese, Wutai Shan. Right? And this is where it's located. It's not too far from Beijing, about 300 kilometers. Until recently, this is where it is. The Wutai is the 5 peaks. This has been a sacred site, as you can see, going back about 1,900 years. It became very important after the Mongolian conquest of China because they brought Tibetan Buddhism. And then the Qing dynasty, the Manchurian conquest, also adopted Tibetan Buddhism as the state religion. And today it's still recognized as one of China's 4 sacred Buddhist mountains. Right? Much like many religious sites in China, it's heavily damaged during the Cultural Revolution. It's one of China's first national parks, and it was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2009. And the heritage zone, because it's set up in this series of 4 zones, with the core zone is around the small town that we spend time in together, Taihuai, which local people talk of that town as Taishan, because this is the site of most of the temples. The World Heritage Inscription List actually lists 12 temples, 11 of which are in this community. And as you can see, the park is actually quite large. Now, as part of this master plan, and this is already being implemented, most of the people living in the town will be displaced outside of the new national park boundaries, about 25 kilometers away. The interesting thing is this is being done because the local authorities are following to a T the UNESCO plan for heritage management. Right? So one of the things that's really interesting on the ground when you get to it is you obviously see this, right? You see a lot of destruction, which is the nature of the beast with displacement. Right? And this is one part of the town where people have been displaced, and there's still some vendors. But then you also see, obviously, a lot of construction, mainly heritage space. So this is, they're putting in roads and walkways and landscaping and tourist facilities. They're building a museum outside the park. But then you also see temple renovation in a World Heritage Zone that has been inscribed in the World Heritage List, so in theory, nothing should change. Right? And then you finally see a lot of new construction around the monastic communities. Right? As local people are being displaced in order to maintain this sacred space as a pure space and protect it from commercialization, monastic communities are going into the business of serving tourist needs. So they're building dormitories, they're building various facilities. Often this is framed as they're hosting, quote, pilgrims. So people will come for a weekend. So the plan envisions this as a way to protect these religious sites from tourism. When you talk to the local monastic officials, the monks in charge, they see this as awesome because it's a racing competition for them, right? And then finally, the last thing you see is a lot of unauthorized construction in a zone. So this is a hotel that is not supposed to be there. It's completed now. It's being built in part of the town that will be demolished. And it, from an economic view, makes no sense, right? Why would you start investing in properties in a tourist zone that will soon be eradicated? And the answer is because the Chinese government increasingly is trying to get ahead of the critical political problem in China, which is displacement. So as the central government has created more and more elaborate displacement regulations and funding for people who are being displaced, in a local community like this, people can't fight the heritage plan. It makes no sense. People are much more practical. So what they do is they're finding a way around the law by, in essence, investing in a business, calculating they will get more money out of it when it's knocked down in a couple of years than they put into it now, right? And we can talk about this more afterwards, but it kind of points to a couple issues. And if okay, so this idea of community, this is a little micro level, but this idea that there is a community in this town called Wutai Shan. There is a community. If a community is just a bunch of people living in a space. There's not a community in the way that UNESCO envisions a community as this collaborative group of people who have a shared interest, same shared interest. So in this particular place, the first people displaced were exited people without property. They were farmers around the valley. And they received very little money, and they've been completely marginalized. The people being displaced now are shopkeepers, right? And they're the ones investing in illegal buildings in order to try to maximize their return. And finally, the people who, the local business people, the ones who they increasingly kind of despise or are angry with, are the members of the monastic communities. Because from the local level, they're saying, these monks are getting rich off of this, right? And this is a scam. And when you talk to people, one of the interesting things people bring up is, this is supposed to be the People's Republic. We had a revolution to get rid of, quote, feudalism, which is the word that's often used in Chinese. So in closing, I want to pose this question. Is this story of heritage making at Wutai Shan, is this unique to China? And is this another example in which people can point to the People's Republic as being out of step with the world? And I would say no. I would say that throughout the world, the states continue to use heritage as a nation-building tool, particularly the World Heritage Marker, and now increasingly intangible heritage notions. I'd also say that UNESCO's turn to collaborative partnership among stakeholders for heritage management assumes that all parties accept the need for heritage protection, which in this case is just not the case. Not only are those most affected by a project assumed to speak, act, and think as an organic or harmonious community, they're also considered just one among many equal stakeholders, including, according to UNESCO, those at the global level. In other words, the consultation process seems to actually about optimizing the success of protection, not actually talking about the need for heritage protection. So I just want to close by going back to the two cases I briefly mentioned, and the case that when you look at the places in which heritage has been contested, it's been contested through the fact that democracy works at the most local level. But from the UNESCO view, the case in Germany was a big problem. They've seen this as sort of a disgrace, and it was awkward and embarrassing. And yet, both in Germany, which we would classify as a highly developed country, and on the island of Bali in the Republic of Indonesia, that process worked out very much the same way. So I'm going to stop there and we'll take questions, right? Okay.